anybody who is either late or can't make it will be able to also have the advantage of this final review. Please feel free to ask questions at any point that anything seems like not clear to you, and we'll try to move through it pretty quickly. And I want to just like say one more time how grateful I am to all of you for, you know, sticking with this distance learning. I'm not a person who usually teaches in this way. I usually teach in a classroom and appreciate all that immediate contact with folks. So you guys have been really great sticking in there with me, and thank you for that. So let me go ahead. I'll start by sharing my screen, and I'll give you my plan is to be able to use the review to do a little bit of letting you know what's going to be on the final, but also to wrap up some final ideas about the class, at least ideas that have come up for me as we've been teaching and as we've been learning. You know, I think that I will then ask you, if you haven't already done it, to go online. You can do it while we're in the classroom here or in this virtual classroom, and do your SEIs, which are student evaluation of instruction. It's helpful for me. I actually look to see how I've done each semester, see how I might improve. So I'd appreciate it if you do those, if you haven't already done them. So let me go ahead and get started. Oh, let me say one more thing. I'm going to drop something in the chat. This is, I'm not going to say anything about this except to say that it's a petition that's going around amongst undergraduate students, faculty, and graduate students. Right now, it's mostly at the level of graduate students, and feel free to ignore it, or if you would like to go on and sign the petition or share it with other people, that's fine. It has mostly to do with the Columbus campus, not our Newark campus where I teach, but it has to do with whether or not the university should continue to be affiliated and support the Columbus Police Department, because there have been some issues there. So I've gone ahead and I put that in there for you if you want to take a look at it. I have nothing to say about it except that it's there if you want it, and I've promised someone I would share it with the students. Okay, so moving forward, I'll share my screen and we'll get started. So this is the terms and concepts page, which should look pretty familiar to you, and I've updated it. I think I forgot last night to put it on Carmen in the updated form, but I will do so. There was only 1 or 2 new highlighted terms from the last time. So this should be familiar to you. I'm not going to go through it. Instead, I'm going to go through another document that I started yesterday once I had written the final. So I've now written the final and I know what's going to be on it. In some cases, I haven't finished all of the language, but I will do that obviously before but at least I know what's going to be on it, and I've decided what texts and what kinds of questions. All right, so here is the document, which I will also place up on Carmen for you, but I'll probably revise it a little bit as we go. So the first piece of important news is that the exam itself will be open for basically about 2.5 days. I'll open it on Sunday at noon, and it'll be open until midnight on Tuesday. Tuesday is our final exam day, so I feel perfectly confident and okay with this. And I say you have 2 hours to finish, but it should take considerably less time. I would allow yourself the full 2 hours in your calendar. So let me say a couple things about what I noticed last time. Last time on the midterm, people who took the entire time tended to do better. All right. I think people that took very little time Sometimes they did just fine because they had studied just, but other times they seemed to be sort of rushing, or they had forgotten, and whatever. Also, I encourage you, if you have time to study on Sunday and Monday, maybe study on Sunday and Monday, take the test on Tuesday. Consider spending a few hours studying beforehand. Also, have your books, your notes, and access to terms and concepts, access to teaching documents, maybe look over or listen to any recorded lectures that are unclear to you or you missed. You don't have to pay attention to the first part of the class. Remember that this is not a cumulative final. It will basically be on Jude the Obscure, the Krapp's Last Tape, To the Lighthouse, and the assorted poems we've looked at since the midterm. So you don't have to go back to Frankenstein. Well, let me make a small addendum to that. You don't have to go back to Frankenstein or Dorian, but make sure you know those texts and the arguments about those texts, because I will probably have a question that asks you to consider comparing something that happens in To the Lighthouse or one of the 20th century texts we've looked at with either Frankenstein or A Picture of Dorian Gray. Okay. Any questions about that part? Just the sort of basic times, when it's going to happen. Okay. All right, there are two sections. The first section is multiple choice. Only 5 questions. Pick the best answer. I oftentimes think that people miss because they think, oh, I know the answer to that. He said something about this. And I don't know, maybe he said something about the enclosure acts. So if I put the enclosure acts in there, you'll think, oh, that's the answer. But that's not really, if you reread the question and you pay a couple times, you'll see that that's not what I'm asking you. So be sure that you pick the best answer. All right. These multiple choice questions are not worth as many points altogether. I would say they're worth 1/4 of the exam. The bulk of what you could do is in the essay answers, which would be like 3/4 of the exam. All right. Remember that the exam is open book, open notes. So have that material right next to you if you want, and along with your huge cup of coffee or monster drink or whatever helps you get through, these sorts of things. Now, I would ask you not to Google the answers, but stay within the parameters of the ideas, terms, and concepts that we've discussed in class. I have ideas in there twice. And again, I've said these are the important things I think to have on hand and to have studied a little bit. I have a little footnote down here that if I sense that you're bringing in extraneous material or language, like I said, look, I don't remember what a transitional object is, and you go to Google and you just look it up and you cut and paste what they said a transitional object is, then I'm going to grade you down for that. And if I feel like you're straight up plagiarizing, I'm gonna report you. Okay, so I'm asking you not to go on Google for this. It's hard to do. Usually I do these exams in person and I can kind of watch. Why am I being a stickler like this? Because I want you to know the material in your own language and be able to apply it in your own way rather than just pulling it off the web. That's why I allow you to have the terms and concepts page where the way that I've explained it and the way we've talked about it in class is right there. So you should be able to get through it. Okay. there are 4 essay questions on the exam. I know I said 3 earlier, but I didn't feel like there was, when I tried to fit it into 3, I felt like there was an extra question I wanted to have you answer. So you have 2 hours to do it. I think it should be fine. I think each of these essay questions you could probably answer in 20 minutes pretty easily. So that's my feeling, 15 to 20 minutes. So should give you plenty of time to do it. As I say, answers should be approximately around 300 to 400 words per question. Sometimes a great answer will be less, but seldom is that the case. When they get to be just 100 words or so, they tend to be short on substance. And so that's what I'm looking for. So your answers should be integrated. And by that, I mean they should be connected to ideas and concepts discussed in class. They should avoid plot summary. I've read the books. I know what happened. Don't tell me that. They should be contextual. So for example, and this is important, so pay attention. So for example, if I give you a small piece of text from, let's say, To the Lighthouse or from Jude the Obscure, and I ask you to talk about it, you want to know where that happened in the novel and what was important about what happened right before and what right after, because that will definitely have something to do with describing and answering the question. So if you're trying to answer a question and you're not contextualizing the quote from within the larger section of the book that it's taken from, it tends to not be as good an answer, and then be as thorough as possible without being repetitive. Any questions about those basic kind of like my sort of hints or ideas about how you should study and take the exam? Okay, good. If you don't have these novels, Jude the Obscure or To the Lighthouse, well, that's a problem, but try to find a version that you can have for the exam. I think without having the novel in hand or access to an electronic copy of it, it's going to be much harder for you to do as well on the exam. All right. So as you study, these are I would say the main concepts, but you want to be familiar with everything on the terms and concepts page, but these are probably having written it, these are the main ones. I want to just give you a heads up. This is probably likely to be the territory that will help you in acing the exam. To know a little bit about narrative theory. So to know a little bit about these aspects, story versus discourse, what focalization is, how it works, free and direct speech, hypotaxis versus parataxis. Now, where do you look to get this information? Well, you look here on the terms and concepts page, you go down to the section here, the first section, and it will sort of give you what I mean by each of these things, right? Story is just simply what happens. Discourse is everything else that adds into what happens, like the language used by the author, any interruptions, points of view, any of that is considered the discourse, all right, as opposed to the story. Focalization, remember, this is how you get inside the character's head and or inside the general feeling or mood of the section. And there are a number of ways that the author can do this. The author can use shifting points of view. The author can use free and direct speech. The author can use indirect speech. These are all forms of of focalization. And remember, direct speech is when you have quotation marks. You know, do well on the exam and good luck, the professor said, you know, with quotation marks, the professor said. Indirect speech is where it says something like, the professor hoped that the students would do well on the exam and silently wish them luck. That's indirect. It doesn't say it, but you know that it's attributed to him. It's his ideas, his thoughts. Free indirect speech is where they're describing the professor, and they say, well, the professor was looking out the window, was hoping, the professor was looking out the window, he was thinking about the exam. If only the students would do well on it, right? So there's no, he said, he thought, there's no quotation marks, but you still know that it's me thinking that. And the reason that that's powerful in terms of focalization and moves you into the point of view of the character is that because it isn't attributed to anyone, it's untagged speech, we feel that it's almost like us having that thought. And the narrator gives us that thought, almost puts it in our head. Okay. Any questions about narrative theory and how that works? I think maybe for the purposes of this particular exam, you should also be familiar with the narrative techniques used in To the Lighthouse and Jude the Obscure. Okay, so this might mean going back and listening to the recorded lectures, but if you remember the books, I think you can probably get it. Do you remember it? To the Lighthouse uses this kind of, I called it a kind of tag team point of view, where the point of view shifts from character to character, and all that has to happen is that the character thinks about the other character or comes close to the other character, and then the point of view shifts and you're suddenly in that person's point of view, right? So that's one way to understand it. Jude the Obscure, if you remember, one way that the point of view shifts pretty is it often starts with a wide lens and says something like, the girl walked across the heath, you know, gets off the train and walks across the heath, and you're like, well, who is that girl? And then it zooms in on her and you understand it's Sue or it's Arabella, right? And that narrative technique is a kind of distancing technique so that you, the effect, at least from my point of view, is sort of like you see the person in their whole objective scene rather than up in their head, and then you move in close and you get them. So those are kind of some different narrative techniques, okay? If you're just familiar with them, it might help you when I ask you a question about that. So this has a lot to do. I would say that in terms of focalization, don't forget point of view. Don't forget objective versus subjective narration. Okay, so subjective narration when you're really close to the person and you're almost experiencing it the way they are experiencing it through their thoughts and feelings. Objective is farther away, right? And it can be farther away both in terms of the description of the scene, but farther away in terms of a kind of narrator that's really removed from the scene. I wrote Freud's unconscious here, but you all know what Freud's unconscious is, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's just to get a basic understanding of like the arguments that I've made specifically in terms of Krapp's last tape, in terms of Mrs. Ramsey's unconscious and the kind of almost death drive that she has with the lighthouse and the returning to the sea and the core wedge of darkness. The transitional object I covered a lot, so I'm hoping you remember that one. There's bound to be some kind of question that you can apply that idea. And then we have a term that we've used since Frankenstein, really, the sublime. So the sublime doesn't disappear from the 19th century to the 20th century. It sort of shifts and changes how we understand it. So I think that the sublime often becomes, as it is in the lighthouse, the sublime becomes psychologized, right? Like the lighthouse, for example, represents a kind of sublime for almost all the characters, certainly for James and Mrs. Ramsey. For Mrs. Ramsey, remember, it's that motion, and it's the third, she says, the third stroke of the lighthouse, or the third time the light comes around, is her private stroke. She feels that particular motion inside of her, and it represents a kind of sublime. In terms of Christminster, if you remember the city that Jude longs to go to, it's really Oxford, but the university and all of that. Christminster, I might also say the university, is a kind of sublime for Jude. And here I think it's partially psychologized, but also ideological. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that the sublime changes from its 19th century form because we change, because society changes, it changes. So in the later 19th century, you see how the sublime becomes more psychologized, but also more ideological. By that I mean that the sublime becomes more and more connected to ideas that relate us directly to the way we actually live. So another example of an ideological sublime might be something like the feeling one has about about a huge success, like getting something, like enrolling in a college that would change who you are. It doesn't really change who you are, but it has a certain ideological function. To be able to say PhD after your name. Like, I remember the first time someone called me Dr. Ruderman, I was like, what does that mean? It has a certain ideological function. So the sublime comes to be more and more part of the structure of the way we relate to the social fabric of our lives. So I mean, one example of that would be to say something like an ideological sublime would be like winning the World Series or winning the Super Bowl. It has this kind of feeling you can't even talk about it. If you remember the basic sublime, how does it work? It's something too large to be cognized, and that at a certain point, when we're talking about the ideological sublime, it has a meaning beyond our ability to put it into words. Right? So the meaning itself now is ideological. That's why that's, I think, a better way to describe it. Okay. I don't know that I doubt you'll have to say any of this in the exam. Okay. So please don't be worried. These two would be very important to pay attention to. Tradition in the Individual Talent by Eliot. Make sure you understand the argument there. Remember the way that tradition, and you don't have to worry, it's all here on your terms and concepts list. Here's Pound's A Retrospect and Eliot's Tradition in Individual Talent. I would go back and maybe look at those texts, but the main thing is to just understand how they work and be able to apply them. So the same way that you did such a good job applying Keats' negative capability in the first exam, here I might be asking you to apply and think about Tradition in the Individual Talent and Pound's A Retrospect. So for it's just this weird logic in Eliot that in order to be in the tradition, you must do something new. So it's this weird way of thinking about tradition as always being a kind of newness, even though it's tradition. And secondly, that when you change something in the tradition, you change the whole tradition. So it changes the way we think about history and time itself. It sort of bends history so that something you do in the present will change what's been done in the past. And then a retrospect in Ezra Pound just has to do with, remember, direct treatment, don't use extra words, and try to compose in a kind of free rhythm, something. That's that. I'm just paraphrasing the basic 3 rules. All right, so is there anything about what I've just said that's unclear or that you want clarification on? These, I think, are the main ideas you'll need. Okay. All right, so let me go back down here again. Before I talk about humanism, I've decided, I wrote last night, I spent some time, like about, I don't know, 45 minutes thinking about what I would talk to you today about. And after having written the exam, which took me considerably longer to do, I started thinking about humanism and inhumanity, which is what I promised that we would get to in this class somewhat. And I think maybe we did and maybe we didn't. But before I get to that, I just want to give you, these are the texts that you should be familiar with. Krapp's Last Tape, Jude the Obscure, Eliot and Pound's 2 Theories of Poetry and Art, To the Lighthouse. I'll just say also the poems, of Eliot, Yeats, and Hardy, which showed up, right? The last poems that we did on Tuesday, I probably will not, I know I will not ask you about, okay? So it's just these texts, all right? And in terms of these poems, just have them handy, have read through them, remember how they sort of function, okay? All right, so let me stop sharing for a second before I talk and just make sure there's no questions about the structure of the exam or anything moving forward before I say these last few things about humanism, which I think will be my final way of sort of talking about the way I understand everything we've been doing. Or not everything, but an aspect of what we've been doing in the class. Okay, let's go ahead and end then by me talking a bit more about this concept of humanism. So as you know, usually we think about humanism as being part of a process of liberalization, a process of individualization, and a process of secularization. So moving away from religion, not a question of not being religious, but not having religion be the governing structure that rules our lives, but rather having a government that is comprised less of kings, less of feudal lords, and more of individual people who are who decide amongst themselves on the basis of certain values and ideas what kind of society we should live in, right? So what I've sort of suggested to you is, like, you know, and many of my colleagues, they think humanism is a dead idea and we should let it go. I understand why they say that, right? But I don't think we should let go of our humanity. So that's the thing I keep returning to, is like, how do we hold on to these two things at the same time as we try to, and it's going to be mostly your generation, not mine, that needs to deal with this. How do we deal with this? So what I'm suggesting is that from Frankenstein onwards, sorry, my dog is hearing something. Shush, it's okay. From Frankenstein onwards, from Wordsworth's lines written in early spring, you know, have I not reason to lament what man is made of man? You know, we've been dealing with this question of how is it that we're going to survive? How is humanity going to survive its own success, right? We've built inventions that can destroy the planet. How are we going to survive this in an age of nuclear, biological, chemical weapons, in the midst of environmental crises of different kinds, during unprecedented income inequality, so huge amounts of wealth, but huge amounts of poverty and starvation, social injustice, racism, etc. How will we survive? So my argument is that the texts that we read so far have something to say about this, right? First of all, they have something to say in terms of a critique of where we are, right? And so I think ultimately we can look to some of the characters and some of the ideas within the novels and say, there is some hope here. So I would say, in some ways, we could be more like Jude and Sue in the middle of the novel. That is when they are not totally destroyed or in bad marriages, right? And in this sense, they're speaking the truth, right? They're speaking their own truth. They're challenging the status quo, and they're resisting ideology. The problem is it's only two people, and so they're very isolated. If they could somehow form a larger social formation, then maybe they could move forward in some sort of way and work towards change. So don't forget Jude's speech when they come back to Christminster in the section at Christminster. Again, I don't remember which section that is, but towards the end, he says to everybody, I'm not a failure. Pretty soon, everyone's going to be able to go to college, which is kind of true. More people are able to go to college now, right? He saw that coming, but they didn't. And so for Hardy, he thought time would do it. I don't think time in itself is going to do it. I think it's going to require people fighting back, resisting, you know, kind of joining together, forming new kinds of ways of governing and thinking about their own possibilities. But Jude and Sue are two possibilities. Lily and Mrs. Ramsay are two others, right? You could do it with compassion, also with art, right? With education, right? This is, Mrs. Ramsay is really big about educating her children, right? With patience and with commitment. So in a certain sense, this novel, even though it comes from a woman who herself was not very hopeful about the possibilities for humanity, it has a lot of hopeful signs to me. You know, art, education, love, patience, commitment, you know. It would require, this is a sort of an early 20th century view of what I'm sort of trying to say, that I think these novels, at least, and these texts have to say to me. I think we should learn in a negative way from crap, you know, in Beckett's play, from Victor and from Dorian, right? We should be careful about succumbing to individualism, especially, I'm not saying you shouldn't be an individual and be different. I mean, that's the weird thing. How do we hold difference, which is a really important value, and collectivity at the same time? That's what we have to sort of work out. But the kind of individualism that separates you from everybody else, right? Forms of alienation, isolation, ideology, right? Like the ideology of money in the case of Dorian, or beauty, a certain fixed idea of who's beautiful and who's ugly, the ideology of pure technology and science, like with Victor. I mean, Victor's name could easily be, and other people have made this argument, Oppenheimer, you know, the inventor of the nuclear of nuclear weaponry. You know, I mean, Oppenheimer and Victor Frankenstein are very related. They wanted to move forward science, but they didn't realize in doing so, they might have gone beyond our ability to kind of like deal with it. I mean, arguably. Move beyond cynicism. I think we should resist consumerism. I don't mean that you shouldn't be a good capitalist and buy things. I just mean that those things should not matter more to you than the people, right? For Dorian, that whole chapter 11 I asked you to read, that focuses on all the things he collects, those things come to mean more to him than any individual person, right? That's a problem. Elitism, all of these different problems that I think we should avoid. And then finally, I think the poets we've encountered, as well as some of the novelists, you know, have given us ways of creating new art forms, new forms of relation. So here you might think about William Morris. This is early in the class, we talked about him. But remember, he had the Working Man's Guild. I'm going to call it a Working Person's Guild because I don't like the gendered language here. A Working Person's Guild, right? So here you have workers educating themselves about economic structures, but also about art and creating beauty, right? So it's a pretty cool idea, right? So I think we can learn from this. Maybe, you know, we can come together in small groups, educate ourselves, make beautiful things, make things that are useful to people, and then these new ways of being in the world, right? So I think Eliot's desire was to use his poetry to be able to show how hard and horrible some aspects of modern life can be, but also how we might overcome them through faith, through commitment, through connection to other people. And I say this begrudgingly because Eliot's not my favorite character, partly because of his anti-Semitism and other things. But I do think it's there in the poems we've looked at. It's certainly there in the Romantics, in Keats and Wordsworth. And I think it's still there when we looked at the poems we just looked at, new ways of being in the world. Okay, so I don't know whether this is convincing to you or not, but here in our COVID, space, I think that these are possibilities. Now, I did this little writing about humanism, and I sent it to a friend, and she wrote back and said, "Oh, please, you're being too optimistic about this." So then and she said, humanism is part of the problem. So I wrote back, or I thought this morning and wrote this for us too. It's a final thought about this, sort of like, Where the discourse of humanism breaks down is when it becomes an issue of individual behavior, like whatever it is, immigrants are rapists and murderers, and they're coming to take our jobs or whatever, individual behavior rather than large structures, right? What we do and what we think is connected to these larger systems of governance, laws, culture, and economics. And one name for this connecting thread, again, is ideology. That's the thing that ideology is our idea about how we relate to the world. So how do we make sense of the fact that we lost our job? We can either say, well, we lost our job because it's more important for the shareholders of this company to make, billions and billions of dollars than it is to just make enough to manufacture something. Or we can say, or the problem is the way that the society is structured around profits. Or we could say it's immigrants that took my job, right? And so you have two different choices. How do you want to sort of answer that question, right? And so I sort of think that the texts tell us that for humanity to continue to flourish and move forward, we need to let go of the notion of a lone individual and our personal freedoms. It does not mean we give up our personal freedoms. We should claim our personal freedoms even more, but freedoms to work, freedoms to have meaningful labor, freedoms to go to the doctor when you need to, freedoms to relate with whoever we want and say whatever we want, these kinds of freedoms, right? That's why I don't think it makes any sense to kick people off Facebook unless they're actually saying you should kill someone, and short of that, you should try to keep it as open a society as possible. So instead, we can embrace these forms of collectivity that have the power to change systems. So we come together in different sort of ways. And we might think of that as being something like individualism, which is a kind of concept that's been talked about a lot these days. So these are my ideas about, what these texts have taught us about inhumanity and humanism. And I think the story's still out, as you probably know, but I have tremendous faith in you guys, in your generation, to make changes, to make amazing art, and to make amazing political change. I'm very inspired by the possibilities of moving forward. So I think that's all I have to say about this. And you have your final exam to take. I'm going to go through and give you participation grades based on your attendance, but I'm going to say I'm going to give you much more leeway than I would in other years because of COVID and because of teaching online. So I'm going to give pretty much full participation points unless people completely bailed and didn't show up at all, right? If people show up on a semi-regular basis, you'll probably get full participation points. Okay, so I don't really have anything more to say, but I'm open for more questions or anything at all at this point. Okay, so can I ask you then to stay online with me for a minute or two? Just take this time. If you haven't already done your SEIs, which are very easy to do, you do them through your Carmen page. It should be open now. Go on and do the, because it's going to close before finals, I think. Go on and give me whatever points you want to give me for the class and how you think I did. It's really useful for me, both in terms of my colleagues at Columbus who look at it and my colleagues at Newark who look at it and the way in which I'm evaluated. So please do that. And what I'll do is turn my camera off so you don't have to look at my face while you do this. And once you've done your SEIs, please feel free to leave. But before you go, just thank you. Good luck on the final. And please be in touch with me if you need letters of recommendation or want to know what other classes in the English department to take. or anything else, just feel free to be in touch with me. Okay, thank you for a great semester and good luck to everybody, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you.